I'm tired of being told what I don't need. I'm tired of being protected like I'm fragile. Taehyung's voice cut through the quiet room, low but sharp, the kind of honesty that arrives after being held back for too long. Jungkook froze where he stood, one hand still gripping the edge of the table as if the world had suddenly tilted. "That's not what I meant," Jungkook said quickly, his voice softer now, almost defensive. He ran a hand through his hair, then rubbed his eyes, a habit he'd picked up during sleepless nights. "I know, I don't want to disappear into your shadow again. Not now, not after everything." The words landed heavier than either of them expected because they were true. Taehyung inhaled slowly, steadying himself. He had heard variations of this before, whispered by managers, hinted at in meetings, disguised as concern. Hearing it directly from Jungkook was different. It stripped away the excuses. "Then don't stand next to me," Taehyung said at last, meeting Jungkook's gaze without flinching. "Call me out when I mess up." Jungkook looked at him, really looked, searching for doubt, for irony, for a trap. "You mean that?" "Yes," Taehyung replied without hesitation, "even when it's uncomfortable, especially then." That conversation should have ended there. It should have stayed behind closed doors, filed away as another private moment between two artists carrying too much weight. Instead, later that night, they appeared on another broadcast without warning. No moderators, no filters, just a live feed, two chairs, and a camera that couldn't look away. Taehyung spoke first, his posture calm but his hands tightly clasped. "We were asked to stay quiet again." Jungkook continued, his voice steady despite the tension vibrating through the room. "We said no." The reaction was immediate. Shock rippled through social media in real time. Applause clashed with outrage. Support collided with accusations. Everything arrived at once, loud and unforgiving. Comments flooded the screen faster than anyone could read. "Why keep pushing?" One comment flashed, bold and relentless. Taehyung read it aloud, then looked straight into the camera. "Because going back would mean pretending we didn't learn anything." Another comment appeared almost instantly. "Are you afraid?" Jungkook didn't look away when he answered, "Every day." Taehyung nodded beside him. "But fear doesn't get to make our decisions anymore." They talked for hours. About burnout that hid behind smiles. About pressure disguised as privilege. About expectations that were never written down but always enforced. They spoke about love that wasn't romantic but was deep and binding, a connection constantly misinterpreted by a world desperate to label everything it couldn't control. At one point, Jungkook's voice faltered. The room went still. "I used to think if I broke," he admitted quietly, "it would ruin everything." Taehyung turned toward him, eyes soft, unwavering. "You breaking saved me." There was no dramatic music when the feed ended. No slogans. No calls to action. Just silence followed by a screen going dark. And yet in the days that followed, something unexpected happened. Other artists began to speak up. Not all at once. Not all publicly. Some in coded interviews. Some through anonymous posts. Some only in private conversations that leaked despite best efforts. It wasn't a revolution, but it was enough to crack the illusion that this was an isolated incident. Taehyung watched it all unfold with a strange mix of guilt and relief. He hadn't planned to be a symbol. He had only wanted to be honest. One evening, sitting in the studio again, Jungkook broke the silence. "Do you ever wish you could undo it? The broadcast, the fallout?" Taehyung considered the question carefully, the low hum of equipment filling the space between them like a heartbeat. "Sometimes I wish it hadn't hurt so much," he said, "but I don't wish it didn't happen." Jungkook smiled faintly. "Me neither." They sat there in companionable quiet. Outside, things were shifting. Contracts were being rewritten. Relationships were being redefined. The safety net they had lived under for years was gone. But for the first time, Taehyung didn't feel like he was falling. He felt exposed, unguarded, and finally honest. Then, without warning, the building went dark. One second, the studio lights hummed softly above Taehyung's head. The next, everything disappeared into black. The darkness didn't last long, but the silence it created lingered. Emergency lights flickered on along the studio walls, casting everything in a dull amber glow. Taehyung remained seated, unmoving, his outline barely visible against the sudden shadows. For a moment no one spoke, not the staff behind the glass, not Jungkook beside him. It felt symbolic in a way neither of them wanted to say out loud. "Power surge," someone muttered off camera. But Taehyung didn't miss the irony. The lights going out right after honesty finally came on. When the broadcast footage leaked later, fans would analyze that moment frame by frame. Some would call it staged. Others would say it was fate. Taehyung knew the truth was simpler. It was just what happened when control slipped, even briefly. They left the studio separately that night not because of conflict, but because everything suddenly felt too visible. Outside, black vans waited, engines humming, security tense. Phones buzzed non-stop. Messages from managers, from executives, from people who hadn't spoken to them in years but suddenly had opinions. Taehyung ignored all of it until he was alone. In the quiet of his apartment, the weight finally settled. He sat on the floor, back against the couch, jacket still on. The screen of his phone glowed in the dark, filled with headlines that all seemed to say the same thing in different fonts. Left speechless. Too far. Brave or reckless. One notification stood out, a private message. No sender name displayed at first, just a preview line. "You didn't have to do that." Taehyung opened it. It was from Jungkook. "You could have stayed quiet, you always could." Taehyung stared at the words longer than he needed to. His thumbs hovered over the keyboard, unsure. Then he typed. "I know, but then nothing would change." The reply came almost instantly. "Things are already changing. They're not happy." Taehyung let out a slow breath. "They never are." There was a pause this time. Minutes passed. Then another message appeared. "Thank you for not letting me disappear." Taehyung closed his eyes. That was the part no headline would ever understand. The next morning, the fallout became impossible to ignore. Meetings were called and canceled just as quickly. Statements were drafted, revised, and buried. Words like miscommunication and context floated through hallways like smoke, thick and suffocating. Taehyung sat through it all with a calm that surprised even him. When they asked if he regretted anything, he didn't answer right away. "I regret how much it hurt," he said finally. "I don't regret saying it." That answer didn't land well. By the end of the week, invitations stopped coming. Variety shows quietly withdrew interest. Brand representatives asked for time. Time, Taehyung realized, was just another way of saying distance. Jungkook felt it too. They didn't talk about it directly, but it showed in the way he laughed less, in the way his shoulders stayed tense even when nothing was happening. One afternoon, during a rehearsal that felt more like a formality than preparation, Jungkook finally broke. "They want me to apologize," he said, voice low. "Not publicly, just enough, so things can go back." Taehyung didn't respond immediately. He watched Jungkook pace the room, frustration spilling out in uneven steps. And Taehyung asked, "And I don't know how to explain that going back feels worse than the risk," Jungkook admitted. "I don't know how to say that without sounding ungrateful." Taehyung stood up. "You don't owe them gratitude for silence." Jungkook stopped packing. "You say that like it's easy." "It's not," Taehyung replied. "It's just necessary." That night another clip surfaced. A short one, blurry, taken from a phone in the control room during the broadcast. It showed Taehyung turning toward Jungkook after the cameras officially cut, his lips moving unheard. Speculation exploded. What did he say? Was it planned? Was Jungkook okay? Taehyung watched the clip once, then turned his phone face down. He remembered exactly what he'd said. "I've got you, even if everything else falls apart." No one needed to hear that. It wasn't for them. Days passed. The noise didn't fade, but it shifted. Where outrage had been loud, curiosity took its place. Where criticism had dominated, something softer began to surface. Stories, confessions, fans sharing moments when they felt unseen, unheard. Protected to the point of erasure. Taehyung read them late at night, scrolling slowly, carefully. He never commented. He didn't need to. One evening, Jungkook showed up unannounced, standing in the doorway with tired eyes and a hesitant smile. "Do you ever think," Jungkook said, stepping inside, "that we were never meant to be quiet versions of ourselves?" Taehyung considered it, then nodded. "I think we tried for a long time anyway." They sat together on the floor, backs against the couch, the city lights bleeding in through the windows. No cameras, no scripts, just two people learning how to exist outside the shadows they'd been trained to stand in. The future was still uncertain. Careers hung in the balance. Trust had been shaken in places that might never fully recover. But something irreversible had already happened. They had spoken, and no amount of silence could undo that now. The following weeks moved in an unfamiliar rhythm, slower on the surface, heavier underneath. Taehyung noticed it first in the small things. The way doors no longer opened automatically. The way conversations stopped when he entered a room, then resumed with careful politeness. Nothing was said outright, but everything was felt. Publicly, there was no punishment, no announcement, no clear consequence anyone could point to. Privately, it was different. Projects were reconsidered. Plans were under review. The word later became a wall no one intended to climb. Taehyung found himself with more time than he'd had in years. At first, it felt like relief. He slept longer. He took walks without schedules, headphones on, hood pulled low. Fans still recognized him, of course, but they approached differently now. Quieter, more tentative. Some didn't ask for photos at all. They just said thank you, eyes shining with something close to gratitude. That unsettled him more than criticism ever had. One afternoon, while sitting alone in a practice room, Taehyung watched old footage on the screen in front of him. Performances, interviews, smiles so practiced they felt almost scripted. He didn't hate that version of himself. He just realized how much of him had been missing from it. The door creaked open. Jungkook stepped in, holding 2 cups of coffee like an offering. "They still remember your order," he said lightly, setting one down beside Taehyung. Taehyung smiled. "That's dangerous." Jungkook laughed, but it didn't last. He sat on the floor, back against the mirror, staring at their reflections layered together. "They moved my solo meeting again," he said. "3rd time this week." Taehyung didn't ask who they were. He never needed to. "How do you feel about that?" Jungkook shrugged, then exhaled sharply. Angry, relieved, guilty, all of it at once. Taehyung nodded. "That sounds about right." There was a long pause, the kind that used to make both of them restless. Now it felt almost earned. "Do you think we went too far?" Jungkook asked suddenly, not accusing, just wondering. Taehyung thought back to the live broadcast, the comments, the silence after, the lights going out. "I think we went exactly as far as we needed to," he said. "Anything less would have been easier. Anything more would have been reckless." Jungkook studied him. "You're not scared anymore." "I am," Taehyung corrected gently. "I'm just not pretending otherwise." That night, a long-form interview dropped online. Not with either of them, but with a senior artist from another group. No names were mentioned, but the implications were clear. Burnout, control, silence dressed up as care. The internet connected the dots within minutes. Taehyung watched the numbers climb in real time. Views, shares, comments. A familiar storm, but this one felt different, less voyeuristic, more reflective. His phone buzzed again. A message from Jungkook. "Did you see it?" "Yes." "Do you think more will come?" Taehyung typed slowly. I think they already were. We just didn't hear them before. The next invitation they received surprised both of them. A small, independent live session. No big network. No strict format. Just music and conversation. Optional participation. Jungkook hesitated when he saw the email. This could make things worse. It could also make things clearer, Taehyung replied. They accepted. The day of the session, Taehyung felt a familiar tightness in his chest as he sat under the lights again. Smaller set, softer glow, no teleprompters, no cues in his ear. Jungkook sat beside him, foot bouncing nervously. When the host asked why they'd chosen to come, Taehyung didn't rehearse his answer. Because silence had started to feel dishonest, he said simply. There it was again, that stillness, the kind that meant people were actually listening. Later, during a break, Jungkook leaned over and whispered, "This feels scarier than the big broadcast." Taehyung smiled faintly. That's how you know it matters. When the session ended, there was no immediate explosion, no trending outrage, just a slow, steady wave of response that carried something new with it, respect, even from people who didn't fully agree. Walking out into the night air, Jungkook stopped suddenly. "Do you realize," he said, "we're doing this without knowing how it ends?" Taehyung looked up at the dark sky, city lights flickering like distant stars. "We never knew how it ended," he said. "We just pretended someone else did." They stood there for a moment, side by side, not hiding, not performing. The path ahead was still unclear. Consequences hadn't finished revealing themselves, but the fear that once controlled every step no longer held the same power. For the first time in a long while, the uncertainty felt honest. And that, Taehyung realized, was something he was finally willing to live with. The shift didn't announce itself with headlines. It crept in quietly, almost politely, the way real change often does. Taehyung noticed it in emails that sounded less rehearsed, in meetings where people asked questions instead of delivering instructions, in pauses where no one rushed to fill the silence for him. Still, the cost lingered. There were nights when sleep refused to come. Taehyung would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying moments he couldn't edit or soften. Not the broadcast itself, but everything that followed. The looks, the careful distance, the unspoken calculations happening around him. One night like that, his phone buzzed past midnight. "Jungkook, are you awake?" Taehyung didn't hesitate. "Taehyung, yeah." A few seconds passed. "Jungkook, do you ever feel like we open something we can't close?" Taehyung turned onto his side, the city lights casting faint shadows across the room. Taehyung, yes, but I think it was already open. We just stopped pretending it was. Jungkook, I keep thinking about what happens if this changes everything. Taehyung, it already has. That answer didn't come with comfort, but it came with truth. Jungkook didn't reply right away. When he finally did, it was just one line. "Jungkook, thank you for staying steady." Taehyung set the phone down and closed his eyes. Steady wasn't how he felt. It was just how he chose to stand. The next morning brought another surprise. A request for a live appearance, not a performance, not an interview, a discussion panel, industry leaders, artists, closed audience, no streaming. "Why you?" Taehyung asked when the offer was explained. The answer was careful, "Because people are listening to you now." Listening, the word sat heavy in his chest. The panel was held in a quiet auditorium, lights dimmed, seats half filled. No fans, no cheering, just attention. Taehyung sat on stage, hands folded, feeling more exposed than he ever had under stadium lights. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't look for approval. "I was taught that silence was professionalism," he said. "That gratitude meant compliance. It took me a long time to realize those weren't the same thing." The room stayed still. "I don't regret protecting what I had," Taehyung continued, "but I regret how long it took me to protect who I was." There were no immediate responses, no applause, but afterward backstage people approached him one by one. Some thanked him. Some apologized without saying for what. Some simply nodded, eyes downcast, as if acknowledging a shared truth they weren't ready to voice aloud. That evening, Jungkook met him outside. "You were calm," Jungkook said as they walked side by side. "Terrifyingly calm." Taehyung smiled faintly. "I was shaking the whole time." "I couldn't tell." "Good." They stopped at a crosswalk, the city buzzing around them, anonymous and alive. Jungkook watched the light change, then spoke quietly. "They asked me if I'd distance myself from you, just to stabilize things." Taehyung didn't react. He had prepared for this moment, even if he'd hoped it wouldn't come so soon. "And I said no." Jungkook replied, not dramatically, just no. Taehyung exhaled slowly. "That choice won't be invisible." "I know," Jungkook said, then softer, "neither will yours." For a while, it seemed like the world was waiting to see who would blink first. Schedules remained uncertain. Opportunities arrived with conditions attached. Every step forward came with fine print. But something else was happening too. Fans weren't just watching anymore. They were listening. Discussions shifted. Language changed. The narrative wasn't about scandal as much as it was about boundaries, pressure, and the cost of being palatable. Taehyung read less commentary now. He didn't need to absorb every reaction to understand the impact. He felt it in the way he spoke during rehearsals, in the way he corrected people when they spoke over others, in the way he allowed himself to pause, even when silence made the room uncomfortable. One afternoon, during a quiet practice session, Jungkook stopped mid-song. "Do you remember when we thought the worst thing that could happen was being misunderstood?" he asked. Taehyung nodded. "We were wrong." "What's the worst thing now?" Taehyung considered it. "Letting fear decide for us again." Jungkook smiled, small but genuine. "Then let's not." The moment didn't feel triumphant. It felt deliberate. As weeks passed, the edges of the fallout softened, but they didn't disappear. And Taehyung didn't want them to. They were reminders, markers of a line crossed with intention. One evening, alone again in the studio, Taehyung sat beneath the dim lights, hands resting on his knees. He thought about the version of himself who had once believed that being silent was the safest option. He understood him now. But he no longer wanted to be him. Outside, the city kept moving. Inside, something had settled into place. Not certainty, not peace, but alignment. And for Taehyung, that was enough to keep going, even with everything still unresolved. By the time the season changed, the noise had thinned into something quieter but more persistent. Not outrage, not praise, expectation. Taehyung felt it everywhere, like pressure before rain. People were waiting to see what he would do next, as if honesty had turned him into a signal they were all trying to read. He resisted the urge to rush. For the first time in his career, he allowed gaps to exist, days without schedules, evenings without rehearsals. He spent hours in the studio not to produce, but to listen. Old demos, half-finished melodies, notes he'd recorded years ago and abandoned because they didn't fit the moment he was supposed to be in. One track stopped him. It was raw, unpolished. His voice cracked in places he once planned to fix. He hadn't remembered recording it, only that it came from a night when everything felt too heavy to organize into perfection. He didn't delete it. Instead, he played it again. Jungkook noticed the change before anyone else. "You're quieter," he said one afternoon, watching Taehyung adjust a microphone. "Am I?" Taehyung asked. "Not withdrawn," Jungkook clarified, "just selective." Taehyung smiled. "I'm learning the difference." They worked together less publicly now, but more honestly. When they disagreed, they said it. When they needed space, they took it without explanation. The absence of performance between them felt like progress. Then came the offer no one expected. Not from a network, not from a brand, a personal request, a live stripped-down performance. One camera, no editing, no script, distribution independent. Jungkook read the message twice. This is risky. Taehyung nodded. That's why it feels right. They argued gently, not about fear but about intention, what they wanted to say, what they refused to explain. In the end, the decision wasn't dramatic. They said yes. The night of the performance, the room was small, intentionally so. Taehyung sat on a stool beneath a single light, the rest of the space dissolving into shadow. No crowd noise, no applause cues, just breath and anticipation. He spoke before he sang. I used to believe clarity meant certainty, he said, voice steady. Now I think it means honesty, even when the answer isn't clean. The song that followed wasn't the one fans expected. It didn't build, it didn't explode, it lingered. His voice wavered, then steadied, then wavered again. He didn't correct it. When the camera cut, no one moved. Jungkook stood just off to the side, eyes fixed on the floor, jaw tight. Afterward, he didn't say anything at first. He just nodded once. That mattered, he said finally. The response wasn't immediate. There was no viral spike, no overnight shift, but over the next few days messages began to surface. Quiet ones, long ones, people saying they felt less alone, that something had loosened inside them. Taehyung read one message twice. I didn't know I was allowed to sound like that. He closed his phone. Later that week, during a meeting that felt strangely respectful, someone asked him if he planned to return to a more traditional approach. Taehyung met their gaze. I don't think I can, he said. I wouldn't know how to do that honestly anymore. There was a pause, then a nod, not approval, acceptance. That night, Jungkook joined him on the studio floor, backs against the wall, both of them exhausted in the way that comes from choosing something harder. Do you think this will last? Jungkook asked. Taehyung didn't pretend to know. I think we will. They sat there without filling the space, the hum of equipment steady and familiar. Outside, the industry continued to move, adjust, resist, adapt. Inside, something had already settled. Taehyung wasn't louder now. He wasn't fearless. He was simply no longer split between who he was and who he was allowed to be. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The real test didn't come with cameras. It arrived quietly, wrapped in routine, disguised as opportunity. A formal proposal landed in Taehyung's inbox one morning, marked urgent but written in language so polished it felt almost gentle. A major project, global reach, the kind of exposure that once would have required no discussion at all. The conditions were subtle, embedded between lines about collaboration and vision. Clear boundaries, unified messaging, no deviations. Taehyung read it twice, then a third time, slower. Nothing about the words was unfamiliar. What felt different was his reaction. There was no rush of excitement, no spike of fear, just a calm awareness of what the offer was really asking for. He forwarded it to Jungkook without comment. An hour later, Jungkook appeared in the studio doorway, phone still in his hand. They're being careful, he said. They always are, Taehyung replied. Jungkook leaned against the wall, considering. A few months ago, we would have taken this and convinced ourselves it was compromise. Taehyung nodded, and spent twice as long recovering. They didn't decide right away. That was new too. Instead, they talked about everything else. Music they hadn't finished, ideas that didn't fit any format yet, the strange freedom of not knowing what came next. When they finally responded to the proposal, the reply was short. Thank you for considering us. This doesn't align with where we are right now. No explanation, no apology. The silence that followed was telling. Days passed without reaction, and then, predictably, the tone shifted. Follow-up messages, revised terms, suggestions framed as flexibility. Taehyung read them all, then closed his laptop. They're negotiating with the version of us that doesn't exist anymore, Jungkook said quietly. Taehyung smiled. Let them. In the meantime, something unexpected gained momentum. Smaller platforms, independent creatives, artists who didn't need permission to speak. Invitations came without conditions attached, or at least without hidden ones. Conversations replaced directives. Taehyung found himself in rooms where listening mattered more than image, where questions weren't traps, where pauses weren't punished. During one such session, someone asked him what he'd learned from the past year. He didn't answer immediately. That protecting yourself doesn't mean closing off, he said finally. It means choosing what you let in. The answer stayed with him. Late one night, long after the building had emptied, Taehyung sat alone in the studio, lights low, guitar resting unused in his lap. He wasn't writing. He was remembering the pressure, the silence, the constant negotiation between safety and self. His phone buzzed. Jungkook, you still there? Taehyung, yeah. Jungkook, I was thinking. Do you remember how scared we were of being misunderstood? Taehyung smiled to himself. Taehyung, I still am. Jungkook, me too, but it doesn't feel paralyzing anymore. Taehyung, fear shrinks when it's named. There was a pause. Jungkook, I'm glad we didn't go back. Taehyung set the guitar aside and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Me too. Outside, the city lights blinked steadily, indifferent and constant. Inside, Taehyung felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not relief, not triumph. Continuity. The understanding that this wasn't a phase or a statement. It was a way of moving forward, slower perhaps, but grounded. He stood, turned off the last light, and stepped into the hallway. No cameras followed. No one waited to interpret the moment. And for once, that absence felt like freedom. The story wasn't ending. It was simply no longer being told by someone else. Momentum didn't return all at once. It arrived in fragments, uneven and unpredictable, like light slipping through cracks that hadn't existed before. Taehyung learned to recognize it not by volume, but by tone. The way conversations started without prefaces. The way people spoke to him without bracing for reaction. One afternoon, while reviewing a rough cut for a small collaborative project, Taehyung noticed something that would have once unsettled him. His name wasn't the centerpiece. It was simply part of the room. He didn't correct it. That used to bother you, Jungkook said, watching his expression. It used to scare me, Taehyung replied. Now it feels accurate. Accuracy had become important to him, more than reach, more than perception. He had spent years learning how to be seen. He was only now learning how to be understood, even if that understanding stayed limited. The shift showed up publicly soon after. A live appearance was announced. Minimal promotion, no dramatic framing, just a date, a place, and a promise of conversation and music. No one labeled it a comeback. No one called it a statement. That alone changed everything. Backstage, Taehyung sat quietly, hands folded, listening to the muffled sounds of the audience settling in. Not roaring, waiting. Jungkook leaned against the wall beside him. This feels different. It is, Taehyung said. They're not here to see what happens to us. They're here to hear what we choose to say. On stage, the lights were warm, forgiving. Taehyung spoke without notes, without packing his words for effect. I spent a long time believing that silence was the safest way to protect what mattered, he said. I was wrong. Silence protected the wrong things. There was no gasp, no shock, just stillness. He sang after that, not loudly, not perfectly. He letters just enough to let the meaning carry. When his voice cracked, he didn't look away. When it steadied, he didn't chase it. When the session ended, applause came slowly, then fully. Not explosive, earned. Afterward, as they stepped outside into the cool air, Jungkook exhaled like he'd been holding his breath the entire time. You didn't flinch once. Taehyung shrugged. I didn't need to. The response over the next days was quieter than anything they'd experienced before and more lasting because of it. Essays instead of clips, discussions instead of accusations. People didn't ask what it meant. They asked how it felt. Taehyung didn't answer most of them. He didn't need to. The work was doing what it was meant to do. One evening, during a late studio session, Jungkook looked up from his phone. They're calling it a turning point. Taehyung smiled faintly. It's just a continuation. Of what? Of choosing not to disappear. They worked late into the night, not chasing deadlines, not measuring outcomes, just building something piece by piece with room to breathe. The pressure to define themselves had eased. They no longer needed to be symbols or warnings. They were allowed to be present. As dawn approached, Taehyung stepped outside alone, watching the city wake. He thought about the version of himself who once believed that being left speechless was weakness. He understood now that silence could also be listening. Weeks turned into months, and the world around Taehyung continued its relentless pace. Headlines shifted, trends changed, and the noise of speculation dulled to background static. But inside, something lasting had taken root. Taehyung sat in the quiet of his studio, the glow of city lights spilling across the floor. The guitar rested against the couch, unfinished melodies lingering in the air like unspoken thoughts. He didn't need to perform for anyone tonight, not for cameras, not for fans, not even for himself. He simply existed, fully present, unguarded, and honest. Jungkook joined him after a long rehearsal, settling beside him without a word. Silence between them had transformed. It was no longer heavy or uneasy. It was companionable, a space where understanding didn't require explanation. "You ever think about how far we've come?" Jungkook asked quietly. Taehyung considered it, watching the city pulse through the window. "Every day," he said, "but I think the important part is that we kept moving, even when it was hard, even when it hurt." Jungkook nodded. "I never realized how much I needed that, just honesty from you, from myself." Taehyung smiled faintly. "We couldn't control the world, but we could control what we refused to compromise on." The studio lights hummed softly above them, familiar and steady. Outside, life continued, fast, unpredictable, and unyielding. But inside, there was calm. The shadows of expectation had lessened. Fear had lost some of its grip. And the bond they shared, profound yet unspoken, had become a quiet anchor in a world determined to label everything. Taehyung picked up his guitar, strummed a soft chord, then another. The sound was imperfect but sincere. Jungkook leaned back, listening, the hum of the city blending with the music. "Not perfect," Taehyung said with a half-smile. "Neither are we," Jungkook replied. They laughed softly, a release of tension they hadn't realized they were still carrying. The past, the misunderstandings, the live broadcast, the fallout, had shaped them, but it no longer defined them. What mattered now was presence, honesty, and the courage to stand unflinching, even when everything else was uncertain. The city outside glittered like a reminder. Life would never be still, but they had found their own rhythm within it. For Taehyung, that was enough. As the first rays of morning light touched the studio windows, Taehyung set the guitar down. He felt grounded, steady, and ready for whatever came next, not as a performer or a symbol, but as himself. And in that quiet, unremarkable moment, the story that had begun with fear and uncertainty found its closure, not in applause, not in recognition, but in the simple, profound truth of being heard, understood, and alive.